Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this beautiful Saturday for another Michael's Virtual Classroom. Today's class is part of the Great Caron Cake Off, where we've been adding decorative icings like pom-poms or tassels to projects made with Caron Cake yarns. My name is Bianca from yarnspirations.com, and I'm here today with your host, Tamara Kelly from Moogly. Tamara will be teaching us how to add pockets to the Caron Chunky Short Row Crochet Scarf. I will be in the chat helping you answer any questions you guys may have, but just a heads up that this class is being recorded. So if at any point you find the class is going too fast, or if you ever want to go back and watch any part of the class today, you can find the class recording on michaels.com/classes within the next 24 hours. So with that all being said, I will pass it over to Tamara to get started.
Hey everybody, and thank you for joining me today. As Bianca was saying, today we are talking about adding icing to our Caron Chunky Short Row Scarf. And this scarf, which I happen to have right here in front of me in my lap, but first I'm going to show you the yarn. This is made with Caron Sprinkle Cakes. Little bright there, let me pull it back a little bit. Hopefully the label's right way around for you guys. Sorry if it's not, but this is what it looks like. And this is just one of the amazing colorways. And of course, this is part of the Caron Cake Off that she mentioned. And if you guys haven't checked it out yet, this Caron Cake Off at Michael's is amazing. Of course, there are all the beautiful cake yarns that you'll find at Michael's and on michaels.com if you're more into curbside pickup like me. And on the website, if you go to the michaels.com website and look for that Caron Cake Off, the contest that's happening right now is phenomenal. Okay, first of all, there are 8 new free patterns. This is one of them right here, this gorgeous scarf. And those are all just fun new things that you can make with the Caron Cake Off yarns. But you can make whatever you want with those Caron cakes, upload a photo to Michael's, and you'll be entered to win up to 500 cakes of Caron Cakes yarn. That's 500 cakes of yarn, which is one of the most amazing yarn prizes, if not the most amazing yarn prize I have ever heard of. It's a crazy amount of yarn, so you've got to check that out. That's what the grand prize winner gets. They get that 500 cakes of yarn, plus they get a 1-hour chat with their favorite yarn influencer, assuming the favorite yarn influencer is one of those that work with Yarnspirations, of course. Now, there are also 4 finalists, winners, and each of them are going to win 50 cakes of yarn. So even being a finalist is a huge, huge, phenomenal prize. Again, still one of the biggest yarn prizes I've ever heard of out there. So definitely check that out. Again, that's the Caron Cake Off, and it's ending, I believe submissions end October 10th. Submissions might end the 9th, right in there. So check it out on the site, and you can get all the details right there on michaels.com. So let's go ahead and start talking about today's class. Like I said, I'm going to be using Caron Sprinkle Cakes, and we're talking about the Chunky Crochet Short Row Scarf. I have to glance down because it is a long name. And this is what the PDF looks like that you can get from Yarnspirations. And this is the finished scarf right here. And it's a long one, so it just keeps going and going and going. But it's got this really, really neat construction. I don't know if you guys can see that with these short rows. And it just makes it so interesting, and it gives it so much motion. And I really think it shows off this yarn beautifully. So this scarf, as written, has these great chunky tassels. Let me find them here and hold them up. Here are these fun tassels. But what's really hot right now, and what every lady talks about if she's got a dress with it, we all know what it is, pockets, right? Pockets, 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 always the best. So you can add pockets to a scarf or a wrap, or honestly anything, and it is so easy. Adding a pocket in crochet is as simple as crocheting a square, or for that matter, a rectangle, or a circle if you wanted some funky ones, and tacking it right on your project wherever you want that pocket to be. Now with scarves, you've got some options. With a scarf, you can definitely just make it longer. And of course, before you add any tassels, you can just fold up that end and seam the sides, and that will give you a pocket. So that's a really simple way to get pockets on a scarf. And then of course, you can just crochet or knit or whatever you want to do 2 sections of the scarf that are the same width of the scarf, just as written. If it's, made end to end like this, it's perfect. And then stop when they're long enough for where you want your pocket to be. And then you can sew that, again, sew that right to your project. So adding a pocket doesn't have to be difficult. Now, if you wanted to add a pocket that was a little bit narrower than your scarf, which is what I've done here, Then you've got a couple options. You can use a whole different pattern if you wanted to. It's another great way to dress up your project. That pocket doesn't have to be the same pattern as the scarf or whatever project you're applying it to. You could use a really cool granny square. You could use contrasting yarn. Sky's the limit. But what I did here is I did use this stitch pattern to add sewn on pockets. And I wanted them just a little bit narrower, you can see here, hopefully, than the scarf itself. Just personal preference, wanted to do something a little different for this project. After I made that square, all I did was sewed it on around 3 sides and left the top open. Now with this yarn, it really kind of blends in, doesn't it? It's a little bit harder to see that pocket on this just because of the colors used. But I think that's a pretty cool effect. So again, if you wanted a contrast, that's easy enough to do. You can see this is, I'm kind of holding it up in front of my face here, but this is a really good size for a pocket. And with this pattern, rather than just working to the depth I wanted, because it has these great short row wedges right here, 4 repeats of this pattern really did make the perfect pocket. So if you go to the chat, hopefully Bianca can drop in a link there. I have linked, I've written a blog post for mooglyblog.com where I talk a little bit more about the pockets for this scarf specifically. So if you get to the end of this and you just kind of need to see the numbers in front of you, that's available as well. But like I said, that's on mooglyblog.com at Caron Cake Off Contest 2020. So if you want to Google that, that's available as well. But let me go ahead and let's take a look at the written pattern. If you happen to have that in front of you, what you'll want to see is right before we begin the foundation row, it actually lists the chain amount, chain 21, and then it says multiple of 4 chains plus 1. And this is hugely valuable information for us because we can use that multiple of 4 chains plus 1 to make a custom pocket for this project that's going to fit and that we'll be able to just follow the stitch pattern as written. We're just going to have a different final stitch count. So this pattern begins with a chain of 21. That's a multiple of 4 plus 1. So if you haven't worked with stitch multiples before, that means you take 4 times whatever number of repeats you want to have. So in this case for this scarf, if we're chaining to 21, that'd be 4 times 5 plus 1. That plus 1, more often than not, is there because either it's a turning chain or because it's needed to finish off the repeat, if it's the kind of repeat that has a stitch that caps it off. So that's a very basic idea of how turning chains work. So we can take this information for this scarf and use that to make our pocket. So we could begin this stitch pattern, if it's a multiple of 4 stitches plus 1, we could begin it with 5 chains, which is 4 plus 1, 9, which is 4 times 2 plus 1, 13, 17, 21, back to the same width as the scarf. And we could even keep going up from there if we wanted to turn this scarf into a wrap or even a blanket, which I think would be actually really cool. It's a great stitch pattern. So what we want to do then is decide what width we want to use for our scarf. I only wanted it a little bit narrower, so I went with a chain of 17. So when I chained 17 and then worked the stitch pattern otherwise completely as written, the only thing that changed was the end stitch count, and I did 4 repeats, then I got this pocket right here. Obviously this is a different one that I crocheted, but you can see again those wedges right there, and it's just 4 of those wedges stacked up and made roughly a rectangle. This pattern actually has a little bit of a lean to it, as you can see. So that's okay. It's not perfectly square. It's got a little bit of a lean, but so does the rest of the scarf. So it's going to work out just fine. I did block it after I crocheted the square, just to make sure it did have as straight an edges as it could. And that's something I recommend too. If you're making squares to add to a project for pockets, go ahead and block those squares before you sew them on. It's just going to give them a really nice shape and it'll help you sew a little bit of a straighter line. So I'll take a sip of water here. Here we are. So with this information, like I say, with this stitch multiple information, you should be able to take almost any pattern and, you know, shrink it up a little bit if that information is provided for you, or if you can sit down and figure it out. Sometimes some patterns it is easy to figure out just looking at the pattern, but then you can customize the size of that pocket, excuse me. Now I did see a question just pop up. How did you block it? For this one, very simple. Fortunately, of course, I put the stuff away right before the class, but basically I have some of those foam pads and I just pinned it down on those foam pads. There are blocking pins that you can get at Michael's. I always recommend They aren't generally labeled blocking pins, although Clover does make one. I think they're called U blocking pins. But basically, you just want to make sure you get some sewing or whatever kind of pins, those sorts of pins. You just want to make sure they're stainless steel or they won't rust. That's important because we're going to, after we've got it pinned down, I like to spray it with water and get it real wet. Some people like to wet it before they pin it. I like to pin it and then wet it because I just don't like working with the wet yarn. You know, it just doesn't feel good in my hands for me. But, you know, some projects just work better if you wet them first. It's mostly a matter of playing with it and seeing. But for this one, all I did was I pinned it out nice and straight on that foam block, and then I sprayed it with a spray bottle of water that I keep handy just for that, for blocking in general. I actually use that with just a little squirt of sort of a fiber wash in it to help relax it a little bit. But other than that, you just let it air dry. Blocking is a lot like, well, basically blocking is if you have a sweater that you've bought from the store and it says lay flat to dry, and you've followed those instructions and actually laid it flat to dry, then you have blocked something before. So yeah, just get it wet, get it into the shape, whether that's with pins or just sort of pulling it into shape, let it air dry, and that will give you just that little bit better shape that makes it a little bit easier to go ahead and sew that on. So once you've got that pocket made, then it's time to go ahead and sew it on. And you can do that in a variety of ways. There's lots of different stitches. If you're sewing right up to the edge, you might find a whip stitch where you just literally go through both pieces of the cloth around and around and around, probably the simplest way to do it. If you want to get really fancy with it, you could do something like the mattress stitch, but I'm going to be demonstrating how to use the back stitch to sew it on. Before we do that though, I was wondering if we had any questions, Bianca.
I think so far, other than the blocking question, well, actually, sorry, never mind. We have, did you use the same size hook for the square as for the scarf?
Yes, and I did. I used the exact same hook size. I just followed the instructions for the scarf exactly. Like I say, I just started with a different number. And that's something too. If you want to add pockets, like I say, to this particular project, that's what I did. But if you were adding pockets to another project, if you're using the same weight of yarn, generally you'd be wanting to use the same size of hook. But you do need to think about that fabric. If you're adding pockets to something with a lot of holes in it, then you're probably going to want to pick a different stitch pattern, unless you're only going to put your hands in it. You know, if they're the kind of pockets you're only going to put your hands in, then you can use something really loose, even like a granny stitch or a granny square, where those big holes aren't going to matter. But that is something to think about for sure. If you're making a pocket, you actually want to put things in them, you need to give a little bit of thought to how tight the weave of that fabric is. And you could absolutely switch it up if you wanted to. You could use a smaller hook or a bigger hook, get a different look. Sky's the limit. That's the fun of adding the icing. So were there any other questions?
No, I think we're in good shape here.
Okay, great, awesome. So I've got a new overhead camera with you guys, so I'm excited to share that with you today. So let's go ahead and go to the overhead camera and see how this works out today. I get to move this one sort of in front of me here, which will hopefully give us a little bit better view of this scarf, because this is a little bit of a bigger project today. Here we go. So you can see here, we have, this is our sewn on scarf right there. And as you can see, it's just a few stitches shorter in width, so to speak, than the scarf itself. And I sewed them relatively close to the end of these tassels here, but of course you could put your pockets exactly where they fit you. Go ahead, and if you're making this project for yourself, go ahead, put that project on, try it on before you sew on those pockets. Maybe put them on with some stitch markers. You could use your stitch markers from Michaels and really pin those on and make sure they're exactly where you want them to be before you do sew them on. Because once they're sewn on, of course, you know, they're going to be there pretty good. Now, another thing is when you're sewing them, if you're going through the fabric with crochet, you have a great opportunity here to work those stitches inside the stitches, your sewn stitches, keep them hidden inside. Now, I chose not to do that with this one because I want you guys to be able to see how that back stitch looks when you do go all the way through. But you could, and of course, if I'd hidden them, I wouldn't be able to show it to you. But if you, when you're sewing, if you're careful, like just like weaving in an end to not go all the way through that fabric, you can really hide that sewing pretty darn well as well. So with that said, let's go ahead and come down here to the other end of our scarf. And of course, you know, if I was doing this for real, so to speak, I would want to make sure that my pockets are on the same side of my scarf. You don't want to end up with a pocket on one side on one end and a pocket on the other side on the other end, although depending on how you wear it, you might be able to cover that up. I did see just a question pop up asking about the scarf pattern itself. This class is just about adding pockets. That said, if we get to the end of the class and we've got a bunch of extra time today, I can go over some questions that you might have on the pattern itself, since I did go ahead and make at least some of it to go ahead and make this pocket. It is a really fun pattern, and it's not difficult, but it is unique, so I can understand if you have some questions on it. So like I said, what you want to do is you want to figure out basically where you want to put your pocket. And one thing you may have noticed, I forgot to mention when I made this pocket, you can see here that final cut end, this was actually the final row there, that way. I left a really, really, really long tail. And the reason I did that is because now I can use that tail to start sewing it on. And that's just one less end that I'm going to have to, actually two less ends, because if I had cut it, I would have had to weave in the end on the pocket, and then I would have had to weave in this end from sewing it on. So by leaving that really long tail, it's two less ends to weave in. And I don't know about you guys, but that's not my favorite part of crocheting. So there's a little tip right there. Bianca, I've got a little hand popping up here for Sue. Does Sue have a question, or? I just want to make sure we're not ignoring anybody here. No? Okay.
No, I don't think so, yeah.
Okay. Oh, I did see one pop up though. How do I know how long to leave this end? Well, partially experience, but I'll give you my little, here, I'll move this so it's a little bit easier to see. When I've got something like this is sort of loose and fast and not fancy, but I take this string, still attached to the yarn ball, of course, and I will literally just run it right along that edge. And it's going to take more than one to do it, because, you know, sewing takes a little bit more. So I'll do that. And then if I'm really worried, I've got plenty of yarn, I might do it a third time, and you can see that's just about where it was. So about 3 times the length of the seam you're going to make should give you more than enough. If it's a really, really long seam, you know, for a different type of project where I'm seaming up, say, the side of a sweater, I might not want to leave it as long, just because that's going to get tangled. As long as it's not so long that it's going to tangle up on you while you're sewing, then you can definitely, yeah, just leave that long thing and have that ready and waiting for you to sew it in. Now, when it comes to sewing it on, like I say, you really want to try and plan it out. You want to line it up. Now, this is, as I mentioned before, this pattern actually has a little bit of a slant to it. And that's totally fine. So we're just going to go with it right there. Like so. So let's say that's exactly where we decided we want to have it. So I'm going to go ahead then and use my stitch markers or pins or whatever you have available. And I'm just going to go around and pin that in right where I want it to be. And I would probably use a few more right along just to really secure that down here. There we are. And then for those looking for the pattern, hopefully we can be dropping that. Be sure to check the chat for links and things. And it should also be linked in the description of the class, I believe. There we go. Alrighty, so I would, like I say, I would pin this all on, and then I would go ahead and put the scarf on and make sure that pocket is right where I want it to be. Now, as you pin it, make sure if you've done that long tail tip I gave you, make sure that that end there ends up at the top. Otherwise, of course, you're going to still have to break it. You don't want to accidentally sew across the top of your pocket. Then it's just a patch. So once you've got it exactly where you want it, one of the things that you're going to want to have in your crochet toolkit is one of these yarn needles. Now, everybody should hopefully have yarn needles for weaving in your ends, but when you're working with thicker yarns like this one, and this yarn, you can see right here, it is a 6. This is a super bulky yarn. So with these really chunky yarns, especially when they've got a lot of texture like this one, you can see this particular yarn has a lot of flecks and little bits on it. If you use a needle that is a little too small, let me try and actually find one here in my little dish off to the side. Here we are. This one, it is a relatively large yarn needle, and if I tried, because I did test this out just a little earlier, I can get this yarn through. I'll go ahead and I really kind of squish it in there and pull it through. But when I do that, you can see, you know, it's catching on those little things, and it will end up eventually sort of messing up the yarn itself. So even though we're just sewing in some pockets here, I still want to make sure to use a yarn needle with a really large hole in it. So you can look for those at Michael's, And it just makes it so much easier. Of course, they're easier to thread like so, but then also you can see those little fun bits on the yarn pull right through. So that is just that much easier to use. So then, of course, we get our yarn threaded on our needle, and it is time to sew on our pockets. So, like I said, there are different techniques you can use, and just for the sake of demonstration here, if this was right up to the edge, the same width, I might use the whip stitch, which is simply going straight through and around over and over and over again. Of course, now that I've pulled that through, I need to go ahead and pull it through so I can undo it, because I want to show you the back stitch. And this is the nice thing about sewing with yarn. I think it's a lot easier to sew with yarn than it is to sew with thread, because undoing those stitches, how much easier was that, right? If I had done that with thread, we would have been in bad shape. There we go. Alrighty, so now we've got that back on our yarn needle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew this on using the back stitch. Just want to make sure, oops, sorry about that. Get us nice and lined up here so we can see. And with the back stitch, essentially, there's a couple different ways you can start it, but I'm just going to go ahead and sew right along this edge. And there's not so much a rule for this. This is just something I'm going to be eyeballing as I sew. So I'm going to go ahead and just sort of take a stitch here that's about the height of one of these rows, a single crochet, and just gently pull that yarn all the way through, including that little end there. There we go. And then what I'm going to do is on the back, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit more, about 2 rows worth. There we are. And you can stick your needle right through there and pop it over to the front. Make sure it's not showing too much, that you're just right inside that edge of your pocket. And then we can pull that one through. And then we will kind of come back up here to the front and split the difference. So with the back stitch, we're sort of overshooting and then coming back around, and then overshooting and coming back around, and overshooting and coming back around. And that is sort of the motion we're going for. So I've gone back the opposite direction, about the length of 1 row. And this really does this yarn does such a good job sort of disappearing into itself, that I really enjoy using this technique with this one. So if we come back to the back of the scarf again, we can jump about 2 rows up or down along the side of our scarf here, so to speak. Push it forward to the front, make sure we're gouging the edge of our shawl, or our pocket rather, not too far in. And then we can pull that through again. Make sure we get both ends, there we go. And then just split the difference coming back up. Right there, so about halfway through. So on the back, since like I said, I'm working all the way through here, you can see there how those stitches on the back overlap a little bit, but on the front we'll only get the 1 line. And the reason I like to use this particular stitch rather for this particular project is because this is a really, really secure stitch. Now, as you're sewing with your yarn, you'll want to tug, of course, and make sure that the stitches are nice and tight. Let me get this out of the way a little bit here so we can see a little better. So you can see it's on there. It's nice and tight. That pocket's not going anywhere. Oops, so sorry. But you don't want to pull super hard. If you pull super, super, super hard, then it can start to pinch the fabric. If those stitches become too tight, because yarn, it does have squish, unlike a sewn fabric or a woven fabric, then it can cause an indentation. So you just want to take your time and, like I say, as I was showing, gently pull each one of those stitches through so that you don't cause a big indentation in your fabric. So let's see, if I pull this one through, you can see I just sort of pull it till it's right up there, but I don't want to pull hard like that. See if I pull hard, how that causes that to sort of pucker in. And that's not the look we want. We want it to look like that pocket's just miraculously floating on the surface of our scarf, really. So when you go to sew these on, you can obviously probably want to use the same yarn that we've used for our pocket and our scarf in this case, because we did make these to match. So one thing you'll want to think about is, as you make those pockets, and if you do cut this long yarn, or if you cut a different length of yarn to sew them on with, is you want to, if you can, use the same section of yarn, use the same bit of colors here. Now with this one, when we get down here to the bottom edge as we sew on, that this would be a little bit easier to see, but I'm going to cheat a little bit and jump on down to the bottom here and pretend we've worked our way all the way down to the bottom of our pocket. I'll just bring my needle right up here at the bottom edge. Let me pull both those ends through here. I need the one that's not attached. There we go. Okay. All right. When you futz it, you gotta fudge with it a little bit. There we go. Okay. So here we are down at the bottom of our pocket. So this section is a little bit easier. We don't have to just kind of draw a straight line. We can work right along that chain edge where we had our foundation chain there. And if you just work right underneath those two loops, just as you would if you were, putting your crochet hook in there instead of a sewing needle. Let me pull that through here all the way. There we go. Then you can see right there, you'll be able to see it, but it kind of becomes part of the stitch. It doesn't really get back into our back stitch habit here. So I'm going to go one ahead, pull this one through, and then go back one. There we go. That's the one downside to these long tails. I want to get caught on everything. But, I will do honestly anything to not have to weave in another end. It's just my personal preference. There we go. Okay, so right there, you can see there are those sewn stitches, but it really does just blend right in with the yarn, right? It looks just like it's supposed to be there. So if you follow that chain right along the bottom there, basically sticking your needle right where you would have stuck the hook, then those stitches will blend right in. And then of course you can work your way right along here. Now, if you really wanted to get fancy, you could, let me get this needle back up here to this side of the fabric. We were talking about how when you sew on the pocket, you could try and keep the needle along the surface of the fabric here so that those stitches don't show on the back of the scarf. If you wanted to take a lot of time and make this scarf or whatever project, but this one it blends in pretty well, but if it was something where it was going to show more, you could do the same thing on the pocket, where you just catch a few stitches of the pocket, pull that on through, and then catch a few stitches of the scarf on this side. There we are. And of course, the sewing, this is a common thing. This is why I always take my time pulling it through. I've accidentally looped around my working yarn, so I need to make sure to get that on the outside. Otherwise, I'm just making a knot. And that's not what I was going for. No pun intended. There we go. And I give that a little tug, then that's going to be invisible on both sides. But that does take a little bit more time, but it will give you that much of a fancier edge. So that is basically that part of sewing on pockets. Bianca, did we have any other questions that I can demo here for the sewing on, or?
I think we're in good shape. I don't know if you want to move on to the actual scarf pattern for people who maybe haven't
Sure, we could do that
before. Yeah.
Let me just set this aside here off to the side of my little table. And I will pull up, I've got some yarn and I've got the hook, but I am going to need the pattern. Let me grab that as well here. Okay, again, this is the pattern for the Caron Chunky Crochet Short Row Scarf that you can see right here. So you know what, let's go ahead and we could start with a chain of 21 for the full width scarf. If we wanted to make the pocket, we would start with a chain of 17 if we wanted that pocket to be a little narrower. If you wanted it to be much narrower, something like, say, maybe just for a cell phone, you could start with 5, 9, or 13, depending on the size of your cell phone. Some of them are pretty big these days. So I'm just going to go ahead and start chaining here. We've got 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Let's go ahead and stop at 13. It's a little bit of a narrower version, but it's going to get us all the way through the pattern. And I want to make sure that we can work through these sections so you can see how they come together. Again, it's the same thing, just a little bit narrower. So we've got our multiple of 4 chains plus 1. So to make the foundation row, we're going to work into the horizontal bump at the back of each chain. And this is genuinely my favorite thing to do as well for any pattern, not just this one. When we learn to crochet, we usually are taught to crochet under those 2 loops, that V at the top of our chain, which is the part we normally work into when we're crocheting into another stitch. But when I'm working into the chain, and it's something specifically called out in this pattern, they ask you to work into that back horizontal bump, the underneath loop. You see each chain is made of 3 loops. We've got the 2 on the top and the 1 on the back. And for this pattern, we're going to be working into that back bump. And the reason we do this is because that leaves these 2 chains right here as our finished edge on our scarf. And that gives just a really, really gorgeous finished edge. And it just makes it look a little bit more complete without having to work a border, because one of the things about this pattern, you may have noticed, there isn't a final border worked around that scarf. So we are going to, let's see, I've checked my instructions here. We are going to work a single crochet in the second chain from the hook. So we skip this one right here that's closest to our hook and go to the next one and work a single crochet right in there, like so. And then we are going to single crochet in each chain to the end. So this first row is just a single crochet all the way across in that very back hump of the chain. So if I pull it up a little closer here, hopefully you can see I'm just working right under that back hump with standard single crochets. Hopefully most of you today coming in already know how to single crochet. If not, do check out the How to Crochet class on Michaels. There we go. So for those who don't know how to single crochet, I'll go ahead and show you real quick. We go into the indicated stitch, whatever stitch it is, with our hook, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, and pull through both loops. And that's our single crochet. So for our foundation row, we are just single crocheting across. So since I chained 13, that means at the end of this little mini pocket that I'm making, I should have 12 stitches, since we skipped that first chain. If we make the full size scarf, since we started with a chain of 21, we would have 20 single crochets. Let me pull this back up here. I just saw somebody say they were having trouble finding that back bump. We've got 2 chains left right here. Pull this up so it tries to focus a little better. See right here, I've got these 2 chains, and those are the 2 loops at the top of our chain. If we flip it over, underneath, there should be that loop right there, sort of all by itself. And that is that back bump that we're working into, oh gosh darn, sorry, for this first row here. So I've got just 2 more to go, and then well, it's actually the foundation row. This pattern, there's lots of different ways to write crochet patterns. This one starts with the foundation row and then the first row. So this was our foundation row, and this is going to be on the wrong side of our scarf. That said, I think this scarf is pretty darn reversible. So, wear it however you want to wear it when it's done. All right, so let's move on to the first row, which is officially the right side. We're going to start with a chain 1 and turn, or turn and chain 1, however you like to do it. And then we're going to work into the back loops only, working a single crochet in each stitch until the last 4 stitches are left. So again, we need to talk about these loops here at the top of our stitches. Let me try and get to focus a little bit here. There we go. So we were talking before, we've got these 2 loops at the top of each stitch, right? And when you look at these loops, normally with our hook, we would go under both of those. And of course, we'll be working back, this way. So normally we would go under both of those loops for a stitch, right? Those 2 loops right there. When you are crocheting into the front loop or the back loop only, you're only going to be crocheting under one of those loops. And which is always relative to you, the crocheter. It doesn't matter what you're making. It doesn't matter how you flipped it over. The front loop is the one that's closest to you, and the back loop is the one that's furthest away. So when you turn your work over, which one is the front and which one's the back, in terms of the actual physical loops is going to change, but again, it's just relative to you. So for this first row, we're going to be working in the back loops only. So that means I'm going to put my hook right in the middle of those 2, right between those 2 strands of that top V there, and just right underneath just that one part of the stitch. Then I can yarn over and put my loop and make my stitch just as I normally would. And what that does is that leaves that first loop, that front loop, unworked, unused, and it creates a really neat line. It's a big part of what gives this pattern its look. So I'm just going to continue working under just that back loop until there are 4 stitches left at the end of our row. So it doesn't matter however many you started with, whatever your stitch multiple was, whether you're making the full scarf or just a little pocket like we're doing here today, you just want to crochet across in that back loop only. Put a little bit more yarn here. There we go. Until we've got 4 stitches left. So we're getting close. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I have 1 more to go. There we go. So now we just have 4 stitches remaining unworked at the end of row 1. And those are going to be unworked for now. We're going to leave those just hanging out there at the edge, and we're going to come back to those later. Because the reason they call this a short row scarf is because we're working short rows. And that's the technique we're using here today. So now it's time to move on to the second row, and the second row and alt rows all have the same instructions. So what that means, if you haven't come across that, let me pull that right up here so we can see it together here. Second and alt rows, if you haven't come across this instruction before, that means the second row and, in this case, 4th row, 6th row, 8th row, every alternate row. So in this case, the even numbered rows are all going to be just like that second row. So let me pull this back up here. So for our second row, we're going to chain 1 and turn, or turn and chain 1. And then again, working in the back loops only, we are going to single crochet in each stitch to the end of the row. So we just want to make sure to find our back loop there, just as before. And this time, we're just going to go ahead and single crochet right across to the end of the row. And I really love working this yarn and this hook size. You can see how quickly this works up, even though I'm taking my time to talk through it, and we're just making little single crochet stitches. Each one of those stitches is such a great big size. So I'm right here to the end. And if I pull up that loop here so we can take a closer look, you can see there's that row, that section of loops I didn't work into, those front loops, and that's creating that look there. And because we worked into the back loop previously, it's creating sort of a ribbed look here. It just creates a lot of movement and texture in this fabric. Excuse me, I'm gonna take a little sip of my water here. All right, so with that, we are ready to move on to the third row, which is exactly the same as the first row. So that means we chain 1 and turn, and working into the back loops only, we are going to single crochet across again. But just like the last time, we are going to stop when there are 4 stitches left. So we just keep working on across here with our single crochets in the back loop only. Did we have any questions on that as I'm crocheting across here, Bianca?
We just have a quick question about how you're holding your hook.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, just talk a little bit more about that. That'd be awesome.
Okay, well, there are lots of ways to hold your crochet hook. There's no right or wrong way. It's really genuinely whatever is most comfortable for you, the crocheter. So a lot of people will hold it this way, and that's generally considered a knife hold. And for those people, they may enjoy using hooks that have more of a thumb rest, sort of like here, a flat thumb rest. Some people hold their hook like a pencil, and they too may enjoy having a flat thumb rest there. Everybody's a little different. That's another popular way to hold it. I think over the years, I genuinely think it has something to do with teaching on video. I've developed a habit of holding mine like this and rolling it a little bit because it keeps my hands a little bit more open for display and demoing. And it's just, I find it to be quite comfortable. So I tend to roll my hook a little bit. So I, again, have other preferences sometimes for crochet hooks, but there's lots of different kinds. And because there are so many different ways to hold a hook, that's really the 2 or 3 basic ways, but there's so many endless variations on that. Try different hooks and see which ones work for you. Like this is a Susan Bates, this is a Clover. But yeah, different hooks, different hand holds. However you want to hold your hook is totally fine. And I'll even change it sometimes. Like I say, for video, I think I hold it or a little more open like this so that hopefully people can see what I'm doing a little easier. But sometimes if I'm working with a really, really chunky yarn where I've really got to kind of put some elbow grease behind pulling up those stitches, that I find myself switching to a knife hold. I seem to have just a little bit more hand strength with that. So it just, like I say, it depends on the individual, but there's no right way, there's no wrong way. It's genuinely whatever feels best in your hand, unless you get the stitches that you like. If you are finding that you're getting a lot of hand or wrist or even elbow or shoulder pain, you may want to try mixing it up. It might be that you're not holding it the best way for you. It might just be the way you were taught. So go ahead and play with that too. You can also change the gauge of your stitches a little bit too. So that can be another little technique if you find that you are a tighter crocheter, say one way versus the other, and you're not getting gauge on a pattern, you can use that to your advantage and purposefully hold the hook a different way. So yeah, that's kind of the basics of hook holding, but it's genuinely, it's so personal. And I once wrote an article on Moogly Blog about it, and I had people send in their photos, and I don't think any two photos were exactly the same. And everybody was crocheting, and I even had a couple people send in pictures where they were only using one hand to crochet. So yeah, just hold it however feels best for you. As long as you feel good, then it's the right way. So I've got my third row, and I think oh, I actually went one too far. I've only got 3 stitches left here. 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that one out. There we go. So that's our third row. So our fourth row, remember we had our second and alt rows instruction. So we just chain 1 and single crochet across, still working in just that back loop only. So there's 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all the stitches I actually have left now. So since we're making this a little narrower, let's pull this back up here and look at these instructions again. There we are. So we know our second and alt rows, we're just crocheting across. Third, fifth, seventh row, we're just doing the same thing again, where we work across but leave 4 unworked at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead one since I made, or actually 2, since I made mine a little narrower. I only have 4 single crochets left. So that's the same as if we were at the 7th row. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind too. And one of the great things about this pattern for making these pockets, we just jump, we've got 4 stitches left. Well, then we must be on the 7th row. So then after you've worked that 8th row or whatever your second and alt row is, then we're ready for 9th row. When we get down to the 9th row, this is where we're going to kind of make that short row journey. So let's go ahead and do that together. And I'm going to set up my instructions over here so I can see them too and make it with you. Okay, so the 9th row, we are going to chain 1 and turn, and then working the back loops only again, we're going to single crochet in those first 4 stitches. So there's 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that's all those stitches. And then we are going to work a single crochet 2 together, and that's abbreviated SC2, the number 2, TOG, and that is a decrease stitch. And we're going to work that into the side of the last stitch of the previous row and the back loop only of the next stitch 2 rows below. A little bit of a mouthful, but we're going to go ahead and do it here together. So go ahead and get this up here so you can see it a little bit better, hopefully. This is the row I just made, so the row below is this one right here. So what I want to do is insert my hook right into the side of that row, just as if we were working into the edge, to edge, like we were adding an edging to a blanket or anything else, a sweater, whatever. I like to find a couple loops, but however you like to work into that side is fine. Going to go ahead and yarn over and pull up our loop there. But before I yarn over and finish, I need to find the next stitch of the row below that. So that's that first unused stitch when we left unworked back here. We want to find the first one of those and go under just the back loop of that stitch, yarn over and pull up our loop, and then we can yarn over and pull through all 3. And that's that single crochet 2 together that's going to start bringing us down here. So if we return to our instructions, the next thing is 1 single crochet in the back loop only of the next 3 single crochet. So we've got these next 3 guys hanging out here. So we just single crochet in the back loop of those. And that will take us to another one of those little edges here. There we are. So we need to do the same thing again. I'll pull up a little bit more yarn here. And so I want to find the side of that row below, the one right above the short row there, and get a couple loops on my hook, wherever it looks good to you. Pull the yarn up and through there, and then jump on down here and find that next unworked stitch right there, and go under just that back loop, pull up a loop there, and then yarn over and pull through all 3. And what we've done there is essentially, it's kind of like we're working into 2 stitches, but only making 1 stitch of it. And that's why we call it a decrease. We're not so much using it as a decrease here, but rather to bridge that gap. But we've gone into 2 stitches and we've only made 1. So that's why it's that basically that stitch. So then of course we've got 3 stitches left right here. So we'll work into the back loops of those to finish those off. And then if we had made the full width of the scarf, we would need to do that a couple more times. 2 more times, in fact, to work down and down and across, just like we just did right there. But with that row 9 now, we've worked all the way across the width of our scarf. You can see we've sort of joined those into sort of a wedge or a slope shape here. So when we do the second one, that's going to even it out. And that's why in that pocket I was talking about, I did 4 repeats, basically 4 wedges. This is wedge number 1, wedge number 2, sort of even that one out, and then 3 and 4, and that gave me a roughly rectangular shape. So let's go ahead and look at our written pattern here so we can see what happens when we get to the end of row 9. Got too many things in my hands here. There we go. So after that, our first wedge is complete. So to continue going, we just repeat rows, our first through 9th rows until the scarf measures 90 inches, ending on a 9th row. So that means basically that 9th row, which we just made, we want to end on one of these, but you'll want it to be an even numbered wedge. So if we worked an odd number, we'd have this weird slope, but the second one is going to even that out. So let's go ahead and start working that second one together. I think we've got time, but my phone, or excuse me, my clock has unfortunately turned off because it was on my computer. Do we have time, Bianca? Are we doing okay?
Yeah, we've got about 15, 14-ish minutes.
Okay, well, basically, I will try and run through it kind of quickly then. Basically, we jump right back to row 1. So then row 1 is, again, we chain 1 and we single crochet in those back loops only. But this time now we leave those last 4 unworked again, and then back and forth. So you can see, since we're leaving the last 4 on this side unworked, how that would sort of basically fill in. But I wanted to make sure we had time to answer any other questions.
Yeah, so we have a question in the chat here. How would you handle coming to a knot in the yarn? Would you just kind of crochet through it, or?
Well, I'll tell you, it just depends. I know there's not a one perfect answer for that because it does happen, you know, absolutely. It depends on the knot and it depends on the yarn. This yarn, let's see, let's go ahead and look at the fiber content on this one. This yarn is 77% acrylic, 20% wool, and 3% other fiber. So this tells me right now, this tells me with the wool, and it's something I can actually feel as well, is that this yarn has a little bit of grip. It's not smooth and slick like, say, a Caron Simply Soft might be, you know, which is 100% acrylic and has a little bit more smoothness to it. And the reason I bring this up is because when you come to a knot, you need to decide whether or not that knot's going to stay. And you can give it a tug. I obviously don't have a knot here, but if I did, I would, first things first, I would give it a good tug and I would make sure and see if it was just going to slip apart. Sometimes that happens with those really slick yarns. Those knots just don't want to stay together. So those just slip apart and then you've got 2 pieces of yarn and you've got your answer. If the knot does not budge, when I give it a really good tug, then I look at the knot itself. I want to make sure that it's not right on the edge and about to fall apart. And I want to make sure too that it isn't creating a big lump and a big fuzzy section. Some yarns are going to hide a knot really well. Other yarns, forget it. You're never going to be able to hide a knot in there. So you need to really evaluate the yarn and evaluate the project. In something like this, where it's chunky, I haven't come across a knot yet in this yarn, I'm happy to say, but if I had, I would maybe take and it wasn't coming out, I would maybe take a stitch with it and see if it was completely hidden. And if it was completely hidden, I might choose to let it go. That said, the finer the yarn, the slicker the yarn, the more likely I am to go ahead and cut it out and just join again as if I were joining a new skein, and just treat it, you know, like you'd come to an end of a skein and you needed to add more yarn. And again, depends on the fabric too. If the fabric was something very thin and drapey or something with a lace pattern, I'd be more likely to go ahead and cut that out as well, because it's simply not going to be hidden in the project itself. So I've got 4 stitches left here. So I'm just going to continue making my wedge a little bit so you guys can see as I answer questions. Were there any other questions?
Yes, so if the Caron Cakes yarn was a little bit thinner or thicker than you expected, how would you accommodate for that difference with the pattern?
Well, you know, it depends on the, I feel like I start every question or answer with, it depends, but it depends on the pattern itself. Now for something like this, like a scarf, I wouldn't worry about it too much. I would Maybe adjust my hook size to make sure I like the fabric I'm getting and it doesn't seem too loose or too tight, depending. But other than that, I wouldn't worry about it too much of something like a scarf or a blanket, because slight variations in the width or length of a scarf or blanket aren't going to be a big deal. And frankly, if I wanted either one to be longer, I would just go ahead and add more rows in pattern. That usually works pretty darn well. If it's a pattern where the yarn, if you're substituting yarns, essentially, basically you're using yarn that wasn't recommended in the pattern, which we all do, we all absolutely do all the time, then you need to make a gauge swatch and basically see if you can hit the gauge of the pattern, if it's something that's important to fit, like a sweater or a garment, where sizing genuinely is important, and an inch can make a big difference in something like that. Then what I would recommend is that you play with that yarn a little bit and make some gauge swatches, see if you can get the gauge listed in the pattern. You see, even this one, like I say, it's a scarf, so it's going to fit no matter whether you get gauge or not. But you can look at that gauge there and see how close or how far off you are, and if you like the fabric that you're getting in that swatch, and then make your decisions from there. You know, you may decide to switch it. If it's much thinner, you could try doubling it and play with it that way. Or you may want to try a different pattern. Just look for a pattern for that weight of yarn. But if you want to make something chunky and you've only got a thin yarn, then I'm a big fan of doubling or even tripling the yarn. I think it's a great way to customize that yarn and really get your own look. If you can see there's a lot of happening in this yarn. If you doubled or tripled this yarn, you would get a really gorgeous, almost twisted or marled look to it too. So you could really have some fun with this, and playing with the different yarn weights that way as well. So let's see, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 there. So yep, ready to turn back and come back the other way. All right, do you have any other questions?
Yes, so I think this may be the last one here. We're wondering if, so does this pattern, because they're short rows, if you're left-handed, I guess you'd maybe need to make some changes to the way this pattern is written?
I'm thinking it through. I'm thinking.
I know this might be a tough spot.
It's just one of those things where I just have to sit and think for a minute on it. I don't think there'd be, you'd be making the rows obviously in a different direction, but I don't think, like I'm holding this as if I were left-handed now to come back this direction. And same thing, if anything, I would say your wedges would run the opposite direction if we pull up the finished scarf here, but it's a scarf, Are you looking at the end, or are you looking at it from, I don't think being left or right-handed. I think you can follow this pattern. Teresa just commented. She's left-handed and it was the same for her. So I think this one should be fine. You can see here I'm on my second wedge, and you can already see by making those little short rows there, how when I work across this next row 9, essentially, that's going to really straighten that out. All righty. Okay, well, thank you so much. All right, and is it time to wrap up? Again, I don't have a clock. I apologize. My clock turned off on me across the room here.
Yeah, we've got maybe 7 more minutes.
Oh, okay, great. Well, if there were any other questions, I'd be happy to answer those, or we can kind of make this row 9 together if people want to see it one more time.
We do have just one last question here.
Okay.
What does unworked mean?
Unworked just means I haven't put a stitch in it yet. So like here, actually I'm going to pull up the scarf where the lighter yarn is. It's a little bit easier to see, and turn it around here so we get the right angle. There we are. So this was the way we were crocheting this portion of the scarf. So right there is that loop. Remember when we worked into the back loop, there's that front loop poking out right there. That loop is quote unquote unworked. We have not made a stitch in that loop. So when we're making these short rows here, you can see these stitches I haven't worked into yet. I've worked into all the stitches, but not these. So these stitches are left unworked until, of course, it's time to come back and work in them. Otherwise, of course, they may stay, like those front loops may stay unworked the whole time. So let's go ahead and make this next row 9 so you guys can see this one more time, because this is what really kind of brings it all together. And you want to make sure that you end on one of these repeats when you get to the end of your pattern. So I'm going to go into the side of the row. And it's a little easier to see now here that we're finally into some lighter section of this yarn, but I just made this row. So this isn't the one I work into the side of, it's the one below. So I want to jump down to that row right below like so. There we are. Just get a couple loops there on the side, however you like to do it. No right or wrong, wherever you like to put your hook. And then that's that next unworked stitch. I have not put a crochet stitch in there yet. So I'm about to work it. I'm going to put my hook just under that back loop, pull up that loop, and finish that stitch. And then I've got those next three where I want to go into the back loop only. There we are. Don't you guys love this color? I think this neutral with this wine color is just so pretty and perfect for fall. There we go. So now we've worked across all of those. So we jump down to the side of this row underneath here. That one loop wants to stick out, but the other, I don't want to find another one on this particular stitch pattern. So if you can go under just one loop there on the side, whatever works for you. There we go. Pull that one up, find that next stitch that we haven't worked into yet. Go under that back loop, pull up a loop there, yarn over and pull through, and then just again, of course, working all the way across. Alrighty, and there, so now we've made 2 of those wedges, and you can see why we want to make an even number of wedges so that we get sort of a rectangle squared off edge. So for the pockets, like I say, I found 4 was really good, but if you wanted to make great big pockets for, I don't know, carrying around a magic wand, you can make it long and skinny, you know, just whatever custom size you want. That's the fun of adding the icing to the cake. Was there anything else I could demo, or?
I think we're good here. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, well then, I think we can probably come back to the other camera and move this one out of the way a little bit. And yeah, this has been that Chunky Crochet Short Row Scarf. And of course, this is made with Caron Sprinkle Cake. So I want to make sure you guys know the name of this yarn because it is such a unique and interesting yarn in some really fun colorways. This one happens to be the red velvet colorway. So nice and tasty. And you can see it's got some really good squish there. I saw someone ask, rows 3, 5, and 7, do you chain 1 first? Yes, definitely. And I want to make sure before I say this, but yes, you chain 1 at the beginning of every row for this particular pattern. Not necessarily for every pattern, but for this pattern you do. Let's see, I did see a question come up. Are we going to post today's class? Yes, Michaels will be posting today's class. You can refer to it and it should be up within 24 hours. So like I said, this was the Caron Sprinkle Cakes. It's part of the Caron Cake Off. Make sure you go to michaels.com and check that out. You could win 500 cakes of yarn. You could win 50 cakes of yarn. You could win a consultation with me or Mikey or Marley Bird or Sarah from Repeat Crafter Me. And you may want to ask how to store all that yarn if you're the winner. So we'll be happy to talk to you about that or whatever else you want to talk about. So again, do check that out. And I want to thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you to Michaels for having me. It's been a lot of fun.